This lecture begins our module on trade policy, and it's focused first on understanding the World Trade Organization, and then on the implications of a country imposing import tariffs while assuming markets are perfectly competitive. The last set of lectures on trade theory demonstrated that there are mutual gains to be made from trade liberalization across countries. We emphasized that the policy challenge given those outcomes was to put in place forward-looking and precise compensation mechanisms to ensure that losers from trade were fully compensated for their losses in order to make gains from trade fully beneficial to everyone within each country. This is not a trivial challenge, and so in this lecture we begin to explore more generally forms of trade policies where countries may choose to either encourage freer trade or restrict trade, and we then discuss the welfare implications associated with these policy choices. At the global level, trade liberalization agreements among several countries occurs under the auspices of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The WTO serves as a forum for negotiations of all types of trade agreements, as well as for settling any trade disputes among member nations. The WTO was formally established in 1994 by the Uruguay round of trade negotiations that were part of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which had been established in 1947. The WTO is a multinational organization with a primary objective to reduce trade barriers between nations. As an international regime on trade, it has in place a formal and independent process by which trade negotiations occur and disputes are settled. The key provisions that member nations of the WTO are expected to comply with and agree to include: first, the Most Favored Nation Clause, or the MFN clause. Any tariff reduction negotiated between any member nations automatically applies to all member nations. We also have the anti-dumping and countervailing duty provisions, which allow a country to impose an anti-dumping duty or tax on imports that are deemed to be dumped in the country's home market. That is, if they are being sold at a price lower than the exporting country sells it in its own market or below the average costs of producing such goods. Similarly, because export subsidies also provide implicit advantage to a country's exports and restrict trade, a countervailing duty intended to offset the impacts of such exports is permitted to be levied against a trade partner in retaliation for such trade restrictive policies. The legality of such trade retaliation is intended to deter a country from engaging in trade restrictive practices such as dumping and using export subsidies to provide advantage to their industries. The use of an import quantity restriction or quota in all forms is considered illegal by the WTO, and member nations agreed to its ban across countries. Transparency in the use of domestic subsidies by member nations to support their home industries is required, so as to prevent the possibility that such support turns out to enhance comparative advantage where none should exist ordinarily, thus preventing natural free trade patterns. Then there is the safeguard clause, or safeguard provision. The safeguard provisions or escape clause allow for the use of temporary trade restrictions by member nations if they feel a domestic industry is unable to compete and have a comparative advantage due to reasons other than the standard technical constraints and where such disadvantage is believed to be temporary. Trade negotiations carried out through regional trade agreements would also be honored and are not subject to the MFN clause, forcing those agreements to be applicable to all other member nations. An example would be the NAFTA tariff agreements between the US and Mexico need not be applied to other member nations in the WTO if they were agreed under NAFTA. The WTO as of recent has about 159 members, with China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia having joined recently in 2001, 2005, and 2012 respectively. This large membership suggests that countries clearly see how, in the aggregate, trade provides benefits for them, and we've discussed this previously in our models of trade theory. To recap again, free trade provides mutual gains to participants in the aggregate. Analytically, trade maximizes the joint surplus within each country, and any within-country distributional losses can be fully compensated for and leave everyone strictly better off. Let us now turn our attention to protectionism, which is trade policy that simply restricts trade, assumedly based on a notion similar to mercantilist ideology. In general, we will distinguish between two broad forms of protectionism: tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade, also called NTBs. So let's look at tariffs. What's a tariff? A tariff is usually applied on imports. Hence, an import tariff is a tax on an imported good. There are typically three forms of tariffs: a specific tariff, which is a fixed charge for each unit of a good that's imported. For example, a 50-cent tariff on a bushel of wheat imported into the country is an example of a specific tariff. An ad valorem tariff is another type of tariff, and that's a charge that varies as a percent of the value of the good imported. An example would be a 10% tariff imposed on imports of wheat. Finally, a compound tariff is a tariff with a specific and an ad valorem component. An example would be a tariff of 30 cents per bushel plus 5% on the value of the wheat imported. NTBs, on the other hand, are varied and include the following: quotas, which are quantity restrictions on imports; export subsidies, which are fixed payments made by the government to domestic producers per unit of a good that's exported; industrial policies, including taxes, labor laws, compliance laws, and so on, that effectively enhance domestic competitiveness globally if they are lax and hurt them if they are stringent; and finally, procurement laws, which are formal government requirements that spending by its agencies be on domestically produced goods where available, regardless of cost, or similar policies that discourage imports by agencies within the government. In the remainder of this first lecture, we will focus on tariffs, assuming a market environment that's perfectly competitive, in order to investigate the welfare impacts of such policies. So let's recall the standard assumptions of such a market structure. Under perfect competition, we have a large number of market agents, we have a homogeneous product, we have free entry and exit, and we assume that there is perfect information. We first make an analytical distinction between a small country and a large country. A country is small with respect to a good if its level of demand exerts no influence on global prices of that good. It's large otherwise. We now want to investigate the welfare impacts of a small country imposing a tariff on that good being imported into its country. We'll start out with a status quo that has the country operating under free trade, but has a comparative disadvantage in producing this good, which means that it will be importing the good at a world price that's lower than what obtains in its own home market under autarky. What will the imposition of a tariff do in this setting? Well, the tariff would raise the price of the good in the home market, and this increases the domestic producer surplus while decreasing the domestic consumer surplus. The government generates tariff revenues. However, the tax creates a deadweight loss from overproduction and underconsumption. The conclusion is that compared to the free trade situation, the country's welfare is reduced with the tariff in place. This is illustrated in the graphs on this slide. We've drawn two settings side by side. On the right hand is the global market, and on the left is the home market for the good. The global market reflects imports alone. In the global market, the line IDH is the import demand for the product from the home country. It's downward sloping, reflecting the usual law of demand. Home consumers would buy more of the good if they can import it at a cheaper price than otherwise. The global market price is given by PW, where the world supply is given by the horizontal red line X. The line is horizontal, demonstrating that whatever the level of demand is coming from the small country, that is IDH, that price PW remains the same. Home imports are thus given by M1. We can track the global price onto the small country's home market and see that it's well below what the market clearing price would be under autarky. I do not depict that in the graph, but you can see it is where the demand and supply curves intersect. Under free trade, the total surplus in the small country's home market is maximized, with a very large consumer surplus and relatively smaller producer surplus. At PW, producers supply a small quantity, and the rest of consumer demand is made up of imports. If the small country's government now imposes a tariff on those imports, say a specific tariff T, this is tacked onto the world price and raises the global supply line up to X prime. As seen, the price of the good now rises to PT and the volume of imports falls from M1 to M2. This is correspondingly seen in the home market by the reduction in the width of imports. The red double arrow is now the blue double arrow. At PT, the producer surplus has increased. The government obtains a tariff revenue, but the consumer surplus has fallen, and there is a resulting deadweight loss. Let's walk through a numerical illustration to further demonstrate this. Suppose we have a small country facing a world price of $20 per unit of a good it's importing under free trade. Under autarky, the price of the good would have been as high as $35. So domestic producers are not happy with the reduction of their surplus as a result of free trade. Let's assume they have lobbied the government to do something about their plight, and the government says, okay, we're going to impose a $10 tariff per unit of the good imported into this country. The question is, what's the impact of this policy on the welfare of the small country? The graphs depict this scenario. Imports under free trade are 15 million units of that good. However, the tariff is tacked onto the world price of $20 so that now the good costs $30 per unit and imports fall to 5 million. This is seen in both diagrams. In the home market, total demand by consumers for the product has fallen from 20 million to 15 million at the price of $30, where now home producers are supplying only 10 million and imports comprise just 5 million. We summarize the welfare analytics next. Under free trade, the consumer surplus is $400 million. The producer surplus is $25 million, and the total surplus is $425 million. However, after the tariff has been imposed, the consumer surplus is now $225 million. The producer surplus is $100 million. The government obtains a tariff revenue on the imports equal to $50 million, so the total surplus in the small country, including the tariff revenues, is $375 million. Consumer surplus has fallen significantly and producer surplus has increased. However, there is still a loss to society of $50 million. which is the change in total surplus associated with the tariff so that the society as a whole is worse off. We looked at a small country scenario. So let's investigate this if instead it was a large country. Again, large in the sense that its volume of demand does exert an influence on the world price. We keep the rest of the assumptions as said before, and we now see the following. The tariff raises the price of the domestic product. It increases producer surplus and decreases consumer surplus. Tariff revenues are generated on quantities imported, as before, and there is also a deadweight loss. However, there is also a terms of trade gain that results from the tariff. The welfare effect in this case is ambiguous. We see this in the graph depiction next. As before, we have two diagrams, the right hand depicting the global market and the left side the large country's home market for the good. In the global market, the large country's import demand function is still downward sloping. However, the export supply is now an upward sloping function. This captures the large country effect, as by shifting the import demand curve, global prices change. Under free trade, the global market clears at the intersection of the export supply curve XS and the import demand curve IDH at price PW, and imports are M1. Corresponding to the large country's home market at PW, the domestic supply is small and the rest of consumer demand D is made up of the M1 imports. Now, if the home country imposes a tariff equal to T, the export supply function shifts up by that amount to XS prime. The new global price is PT, which is less than the amount given by PW plus T. The reason for this is that the initial attempt to tack on the full tariff to the world price leads to a surplus as home's imports demand falls considerably, so that the foreign firms are forced to lower prices, and as a result the world price falls to PW prime given by the green dotted line. The domestic price of the good is now at PT and imports have fallen to M2. The result of all of this is that, as before, consumer surplus at home falls, producer surplus increases, the government obtains revenues on import tariffs, and there is a deadweight loss. However, there is also a terms of trade gain for the large country because foreign suppliers absorbed some of the tariff by lowering the world price. Let's illustrate this again with another example. Suppose now we have a large country importing products under free trade at a world price of $8 per unit. Under autarky, the good would have been sold in its home market at $18 per unit. So this world price reduces producer surplus considerably. So again, we assume they lobby the government and the government agrees to impose a tariff of $8 per unit on the good. How does this affect the welfare of this country? As shown, under free trade, at the price of $8 per unit, imports into the large country are 7 million. However, with the tariff of $8 per unit, the home price of the good now rises to $12 per unit. The natural question is, why not $16 per unit? The reason for this change is due to the large country effect. If foreign producers attempt to pass on the full $8 tariff to domestic consumers by having them import at $16, a surplus is generated in the global market. This forces foreign producers to lower their price to clear the surplus, and this continues until it gets to $12 as in our example, where the global market clears, with the large country now importing 4.2 million units at that price. The fall in foreign price means the world price is no longer at $8 per unit but now at $4 per unit, since they still have to pay the tariff difference of $8 on each unit that they sell to home consumers. Thus, the tariff has obtained a terms of trade gain in the sense that import prices have fallen. The tariff has increased domestic production to 1.8 million units and reduced total consumer demand from 8 to 6 million units. The welfare effects are computed next. Under free trade, the consumer surplus was $64 million, the producer surplus $2.5 million, and the total surplus was therefore $66.5 million. With the tariff in place, consumer surplus has fallen to $36 million. The producer surplus has increased to $8.1 million. The government obtains revenues of $33.6 million, and the total surplus, including the government revenue, is now $77.7 million. Consumer surplus has fallen significantly, and producer surplus has increased. There is a deadweight loss of $5.6 million. However, the government has generated revenues that includes a terms of trade gain, which in this illustration is $16.8 million, and this is larger than the deadweight loss. So the large country is better off than under free trade with the imposition of a tariff. Note, the terms of trade gain is the product of the fall in the world price, i.e. $4, and the amount of imports, 4.2 million. Okay, we now need to add a caveat here, since we have a result that seems to contradict our stance on the advantages of free trade. It's important to keep in mind that in general, the terms of trade gain need not be larger than the deadweight loss. In fact, it's very difficult for that to happen. If protection is intended to provide more surplus to producers, then the government is likely to impose a fairly large tariff. This has the effect of increasing exponentially the deadweight loss. Further, if the export supply function is fairly elastic, then the terms of trade gain is not going to be large, as the fall in the world prices will be modest. These two possibilities are more likely in the real world. However, it should also be clear that the terms of trade gain means a terms of trade loss for the foreign country or countries involved. That reduces their welfare and typically would lead them to impose their own tariffs in the hopes of obtaining terms of trade gains on other products. A trade war therefore results and makes everyone strictly worse off. So while our analysis illustrated a possible outcome where a tariff provided welfare gains, the welfare effect of a tariff imposed by a large country is largely ambiguous, and actually it's more likely that the outcome is that it reduces welfare than otherwise. As a technical exercise, if we assume that there is no retaliation from the foreign trade partner, then it's possible to try to determine the optimal tariff that a large country can impose that would maximize its welfare. The graph on the right plots the relationship between tariffs and the large country's welfare. As you can see, welfare increases to point C from point B provided the tariff is small. But as the tariff gets larger, it falls back to the free trade welfare level, and if it gets even larger, then it creates welfare losses. To determine the tax rate that gives C, a concise formula is given by the inverse of the elasticity of the export supply function. So for example, suppose the export supply function has an elasticity of 2. Then the optimal tax rate is 1/2 or 0.5%. Elastic export supply functions therefore call for very small tax rates, whereas inelastic export supply functions require much higher tax rates for optimality. Now, countries in general typically have tariff schedules over possible imports. The concept of the effective rate of protection measures the actual amount of protection that domestic sellers obtain from the overall tariff schedule. The formula is given as follows. The ERP, which is the effective rate of protection, is equal to the difference between the tariff on a final good and the tariff on component parts of the good weighted by the fraction of the value of the final good that comprises the component parts and divided by 1 minus that weight. To illustrate how this concept works, let's look at an example. Suppose that the global price of an automobile is $20,000 under free trade. If the value of the parts used in automobile assembly is about $16,000, then a tariff schedule imposed by a small home country where the tariff on automobiles is 10% and the tariff on parts is 5% provides home sellers an effective rate of protection of 30% as computed. Intuitively, home sellers are not just provided 10% protection by the tariff on automobiles, but the value of the assembling the automobile together has increased from $4,000 to $5,200 after we take into account all tariffs, and this is an increase of 30%. We are now ready to summarize our discussion so far. From a national perspective, tariffs imposed in a world of perfect competition in that market will more than likely reduce the country's welfare. Even when there is a tariff schedule put in place to provide an effective rate of protection higher than the stated low tariff, it assumes that domestic parts producers will not want tariffs as well on these parts. Ultimately, the effective rate of protection may collapse to being equal to the tariff on the final product. Whatever the case, there will likely be retaliation from the trade partner when a tariff is imposed, and this leads to a welfare-reducing outcome. What are our next steps? Well, let's first take the quiz associated with this lecture. Go ahead and read through the relevant chapter in the text, and get ready to listen to the next lecture where we look at the welfare impacts of selective NTBs under perfect competition.